you so much for being here. My name is Colleen, and I am the Genealogy and Community History Librarian here at the Aurora Public Library District. And we are so delighted to present this event tonight in partnership with the City of Aurora LGBTQ Advisory Board. So I'm just going to hand it over to Zachary Bishop to say a few words on their behalf.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here this evening. I'm Zachary Bishop. I'm honored to be the chair of the Aurora LGBTQ Advisory Board. We're so grateful to have Michael Lee here with us this evening to talk about his newly published biography of the Trailblazing Gay Journalist and Aurora native, Randy Shilts. Thank you so much, Michael, for making the trip. Randy is one of the few LGBTQ+ historical figures with ties to Aurora and the greater western suburbs. And I hope that you all leave here today feeling a little prouder of Aurora as you learn about Randy's remarkable life and career. Before I hand it over to Colleen and Michael, I wanted to just share a few events that the board has upcoming. We have quite a busy December coming up. So Saturday, December 14th, we're having our Rainbows and Ribbons gift drive and wrapping party. We're collecting gifts for the children served by the Simply Destiny Youth Center here in Aurora. And then on Saturday, the 21st, we're having our coffee and community meetup at Society 57. And on Monday, December 23rd, we're co-sponsoring the Paramount Theater's Movie Monday showing of The Wizard of Oz. And then in January, on January 11th, we're having our Transformation Self-Defense Workshop. So if you're interested in any of those events, please come and talk to us at our table, and we'll be happy to share more information. But yeah, with that, I'll hand it over to Michael and Colleen.
So we are so thrilled to welcome author Michael Lee. For more than 20 years, Michael Lee has had a passion for storytelling that has fueled the dynamic career of LGBTQ+ and HIV/AIDS organizing, human services, research, writing, and teaching. He has taught graduate courses at St. Mary's University of Minnesota for more than a decade while working as a professional grant writer. In October, Michael published When the Band Played On, The Life of Randy Shilts, America's Trailblazing Gay Journalist. Michael conducted interviews with Shilts' family, friends, college professors, colleagues, informants, lovers, and critics. The resulting narrative tells the tale of a singularly gifted voice, a talented yet insecure young man whose coming of age became intricately linked to the historic peaks and devastating perils of modern gay liberation. And I also just wanted to note that this book is on sale courtesy of Yellowbird Books, who are at the back. It's Aurora's local bookstore, so please visit them at the back after the program, and Michael will be signing books at that time as well. So now please join me in welcoming Michael Lee.
Thank you so much. Projecting well with okay, good. It's truly an honor to be back in Randy's hometown. When the book launched, I was in San Francisco, which became his adopted home for many years, which was also a very moving event with a crowd of people that included many who knew and loved Randy and remembered him and remembered his trailblazing work. So to come back to Aurora, which was so influential in his life and in his upbringing, is really meaningful for me. And I want to take a moment to thank Colleen, as well as Zachary and the City of Aurora for their support for this. I also wanted to mention when I came here to do research on Randy several years ago, I think it was Colleen's predecessor in the role, Rob Winder, I believe was his name, who was also very encouraging in this work and suggested coming back here to do this exact talk, which was several years ago. So it's nice to be able to fulfill that circle in terms of where the conversations where this research has taken me. So I'm going to open tonight with a reading, and then we should have plenty of time for question and answer, discussion. And I wanted to pick something tonight as a little different from my usual reading because I wanted to give you something that sort of spoke to the flavor of Randy's upbringing here in Aurora. So this goes way back to the early 60s is where I'm starting with this, which was a different time, a different period in our country, obviously a different time in Randy's life. He was not yet aware or open about his sexuality, but some of those first inklings were beginning to occur. And that's kind of where this reading picks up. So I'm going to start with that. He tried to look serious even when he smiled. Standing in his Eagle Scout uniform between his parents Bud and Norma, Randy cast a wary eye toward the camera. The moment was ready-made for local news. The father, a scoutmaster for Wesleyan United Methodist Church, presenting his 14-year-old son with the God and Country Medal. It's hardly surprising that Randy took to scouting. Alongside other boys, he was learning how to uphold a patriotic, morally responsible vision of American manhood. Out of sight from grown-ups, however, came other, more clandestine lessons. Those first unspoken encounters were meaningless, after all, nothing more than curious adolescents fooling around after sacking in for the night. Easily dismissed as innocent play, Randy's first sexual experiences offered new sensations and fraternal comfort in the form of mutual touch and the intimacy of shared secrets. No one needed to know, and no one made trouble about it. It was difficult to even articulate those attractions, at least in any positive terms. Nobody talked about that back then. There weren't words for it, he later recalled. There wasn't a sense that gay people were a minority group that deserved civil rights, so there was no one I could talk to. It was my secret alone. Pervert was one word for it. Homosexual, a term for sissies who never outgrew their embarrassing girlishness, was equally undesirable. The most accepting comment he'd heard, uttered by his favorite sociology teacher, was that maybe homosexuals were just sick, not criminals. More commonly, his brother Gary remembered, people just called them fags. Hearing these words not only made Randy more determined to bury his truth. As he entered high school, he practiced hard to be as all-American as any other boy. In becoming the oldest son at home, he even formed a protective relationship with his younger brothers, taking Reed to downtown movie matinees and watching the Beatles together on the Ed Sullivan Show. To the casual observer, Randy's teenage life would seem normal in almost every facet. Only one person truly understood how hard he worked to get everything just right. Randy barely knew Sally Eck when he asked her out to an Aurora West High School football game in the fall of their 10th grade year. The tiny, sweet-natured blonde from English class found him charming and smart, projecting confidence and eager to try everything that high school sweethearts were supposed to do. Randy courted her with perfect manners, never raising his voice, and even his cantankerous moments were gentle and mocking. He didn't like my red lipstick, which was the only color I ever wore, Sally laughed, and he would tease and call me Ruby. He was kind of contentious, but very loving and very sweet. Having no positive examples at home, Randy had to teach himself social graces. Any little flub, Sally recalled, left him feeling terribly embarrassed. For their first homecoming dance, they went out for Italian beef sandwiches with fries and lots of ketchup, his favorite, not realizing that couples were supposed to go to fancy restaurants. He also didn't know that boys were supposed to buy their dates a corsage until a girl pointed to a tiny floral detail on the waist of Sally's dress, asking, "Where's your flower? Is that it?" Mortified, Randy made sure that from then on, Sally had the best corsages and only ate at the finest restaurants. The pair spent more time with her family than his, and Sally's relatives took to Randy easily. We were meager people, but we had a sense of family, she recalled, and he was accepted into the family very much. It didn't take long, however, for Sally to catch on to one of Randy's secrets. He was saving up to get away. In the evenings, he started working at a factory and took a weekend job sewing shoes. With money, he was able to buy his own clothes, a suitably young Republican blazer, dress shirts, and corduroys. Appraising the new wardrobe, his mother simply told him, "You look prancy. You're prancy." And that, of course, was an effeminate assault on him, Sally explained. Randy never told her about the beatings, but by then Norma's tactics had changed. Once he grew big enough to fight back, she simply cut him down with words. For Christmas, Randy gave Sally a collection of Ayn Rand books. In turn, Sally asked her art teacher to make Randy a silver ring inscribed with a $, signifying the freedom that money represented. From his parents, he received a snow shovel. In later years, Randy's teenage conservatism would become a source of embarrassed amusement, but at the time it made perfect sense. He belonged to a family of anti-war Republicans whose father, a staunch Goldwater supporter, had joined the local John Birch Society, while Norma decorated the front lawn with anti-Vietnam protest signs. Moreover, Randy had cultivated a stubborn belief in success through individual achievement. He'd worked hard to get good grades while rising to the rank of Eagle Scout, holding 2 jobs and courting a steady girlfriend. A card-carrying member of Students for Reagan, Randy became Aurora West High's de facto conservative leader when he founded a chapter of Young Americans for Freedom, the YAF. He was the movement's true believer, telling Sally that Lyndon Johnson hadn't really won in a landslide, as the ballot boxes had clearly been stuffed. After debating his history and civics teachers, he'd handed out leaflets made on a mimeograph machine to be kept in the backyard. Outside school, those efforts began to attract attention. He eats, thinks, and drinks ideas, the Aurora Beacon News headline proclaimed in early 1968. Randy gave a studied, sober interview, urging readers to study the philosophies of our leaders rather than just study what they do. He added, the only way to understand issues is to study the why behind them. In the interview, Randy championed a conservatism that claimed to welcome robust, principled debate from all sides. Chances are he will continue to debate with his instructors, whether PhDs or teaching assistants, the story predicted, and he doesn't expect to be out-talked. By the end of his junior year, Randy's success seemed more a question of when than if. As classmates praised his principal conservatism and debating tenacity. Always be so broad-minded as you are now, advised his history teacher. No one, not even Sally, knew that he was already questioning those beliefs. As 1968 brought one upheaval after another, Randy, a fervently anti-war conservative who loved debates but hated violence, felt conflicted as he tried to find a middle ground. Although he parted with the YAF, he quickly found that leftist activists had little use for his political philosophizing. When Randy spoke out against violent tactics at an anti-war activist gathering, a woman slapped him. Retreating from his activism, Randy tried to refashion himself as an independent writer, poet, and cultural critic. Reviewing the Beatles' Revolution for West High's student newspaper, he took broad swipes at his own generation, characterizing them as ill-prepared masses unable to think for themselves. Critics who accused the Beatles of selling out were missing the point, Randy explained. The song was a commentary on today's self-styled, comfortably middle-class revolutionary, the charismatic follower who repeats an empty slogan, "It's gonna be all right." With no movement to call his own, Randy seemed to drift. As his attentions to Sally seemed to wane, she turned to another, more persistent suitor, Randy's only friend from 6th grade, Stuart Jones. Throughout high school, Stuart had made no secret of his crush on Sally, and with Randy appearing to lose interest during their senior year, she decided to give his rival a chance. Randy protested that Sally must have lost her mind, but otherwise he did little to plead his case. Though they occasionally ran into each other around town, the two otherwise never spoke again. After turning 18, the recent graduate faced more questions than his hometown could answer. Among the Shilts boys, getting as far away as possible had become a rite of passage. Gary had left for college and the Air Force, while Denny fled the country to avoid Vietnam. Like his older brothers, Randy knew he needed to escape, but he didn't yet know how he'd do it. The idea came to him on Christmas Day, 1969. Sitting stoned in a friend's bathtub, Randy's thoughts wandered as she told him about hitchhiking west. He'd love it, she insisted. People on the West Coast were so much more laid back. She'd even met people who went with both men and women. Bisexuality. Randy made a mental note, but said nothing. In his foggy, spaced out mind, he was already making plans. That is my reading from Aurora. I can certainly continue, but this is Randy's hometown. I'm sure there are people here who knew him. I would love to open this up to hear your questions or comments for discussion. And we can do this. If people want to raise their hand or come up to the front, however we'd like to do it. We'd like to start. Go ahead.
Anything else that was really influential from Aurora in his life besides just the upbringing?
He continually checked back in with Aurora throughout his career, including, I would say, in the worst parts of the AIDS crisis, because Randy very much wanted to keep an eye on how America was responding to AIDS outside of San Francisco and outside of New York. Now, his parents moved to Michigan shortly after he left and hitchhiked his way across to Oregon. So the family lived his parents lived in southern Michigan for the rest of their lives. His brother Gary remained here, and who later married his wife Judy, had two daughters, Victoria and Betsy. And so he would still come back to see his family. But what I found most interesting was, especially at the peak of his AIDS writing, his AIDS journalism, he would check in on Aurora to see what the local response was looking like and how that compared with what was happening in the coastal areas where AIDS was first noticed in these big clusters. And so I did come across occasionally in my research that Randy would write about Aurora, or he would write pieces for the Aurora newspaper. So it was important to him, and it was a touchstone. I think in many ways he saw Aurora as representative of that sort of heartland Midwest that often gets talked about by the coastals. And I live in Minnesota, so I also live in flyover country. So I know how that can feel like, but especially because he had been sounding the alarm about AIDS from such an early point in his journalism, and was raising the alarms on how it was likely to, HIV was likely to start cropping up across the United States and not just be in these isolated clusters. Aurora, he used at times to be very representative of what that experience was like in the Midwest. So he did come back to that, not as a regular feature of his work, but when he wanted to touch base with what was happening in the heartland of the country, Aurora was a place that he did mention. Excellent question, by the way. Go ahead.
I seem to remember one of his relatives, and I thought it was his father, writing letters to the Beacon News, but maybe it was his brother. It seems like the fellow was an attorney. Is his brother an attorney?
Gary was a bankruptcy attorney, yes.
Okay.
Yes, and he was still practicing in Aurora close to the end of his life. We lost Gary about 2.5 years ago, and I was sorry that he didn't make it to be able to see this, because he was an excellent, very generous source for me. And my first experience with Gary was a cold call, actually. This was over 10 years ago, and I just started work on this project and did just a simple Google search and got the number for his law office. And I thought, here's this stranger from halfway across the country calling about his brother. I'm just going to leave him, very Midwestern. I don't want to. And his receptionist said, well, he's here right now. Do you want to talk to him? And I said, okay, I don't want to bother him. I couldn't get him off the phone. And he was so happy to talk to me about his brother, and gave me his brother Reed's number to call him directly. It actually sort of reached the point in the conversation, as he kept going and going and going, that I had to be the one saying, well, I'm sure you're very busy. I'm gonna, I'll beg off your time. But Gary was very representative of Randy's family, which, even though they were not a close family, one thing they tell me they've all hold in common is their pride in Randy and what he was able to accomplish. So Gary also, parenthetically, this didn't quite make it into the book, but he ran for governor of Illinois as the Libertarian candidate in 1986. So somewhere in Randy's papers in San Francisco Library, there's a box with a T-shirt that says Shilts for governor. So he was very proud of that and liked to show that off to friends.
What year did he graduate from high school?
1969. And I found that to be sort of a wonderful total coincidence, because for those who understand LGBTQ history, he graduated from high school the same month that the Stonewall Rebellion, the riots, happened in New York. And so as this revolutionary event is occurring that most of the mainstream wouldn't have known about, here he was coming of age at the same time, and it would be another 2 years before he came out, which is another fun story in the book. But he was very much part of that generation that I would say was lifted up and empowered by the events of Stonewall, and became part of the young people that emerged from that the new group of sort of young gay activists and militants that, in the spirit of Stonewall, were building a movement that would not, that would not go back in the closet. And so Randy's coming of age and the coming of age of that phase of gay liberation, sync up right to that month of June 1969. So I thought that was just kind of a cool little coincidence to have there. Is there anyone here who knew Randy?
Yes,
Hi.
My name's Roger Field. I graduated from West High in 1964. Dennis and I were classmates and childhood friends. So I was acquainted with Randy, but didn't have much interaction with him. So I'm very impressed that he was an Eagle Scout. His dad was the assistant scout master at the troop that I was in. And both Dennis and I were involved. That's the #2 boy in that particular troop. I didn't make it to Eagle Scout. Actually, Dennis and I bailed out about 8th grade and didn't go back to scouting. Dennis played in the band. I played in the band. In like the junior and senior year of high school, I didn't have much. We did not have much many classes together, so we didn't socialize too much. I was in the Army in 1969 and 70. And when I got out in 1971, I came back to Aurora, and maybe a few years after that, I saw Dennis, but I didn't know anything about what was going on with Randy, Reed, or David. So this, I did read a book about maybe a little less than 10 years ago, a biography about him. So I'm looking forward to reading this one too and getting more information and enlightenment about it. Mr. Shilts was the assistant scoutmaster. We were in Springfield, Illinois for I think it was a 25-mile hike. And that was difficult, but we made it. And Mr. Shilts was a World War II veteran. He served in the European theater. He was involved with the liberation or going to where some of the torture and I don't know if it's torture, but the
DACA.
murder, murder of the Jewish people.
Yes.
And so, that weighed heavily on me. Also, there were other people in my childhood whose dads had been in Army or naval action in the Pacific or the Atlantic or the European, and it made an impression on me. Their stories were very troubling, but it was the truth. And that's what people need to know. And as I look around this room, I know Mr. Ward, I don't know if we were classmates, but we were close together and.
You're older than
I hired the other lawyer one time in the house sale, but, I've seen you around from time to time, and it's always great to see you. And, I wish I could say more about Randy, but, I didn't go to college. I moved with the family to Evanston, and shortly thereafter, I started working on the railroad. The Chicago, Burlington, Quincy Railroad, in Cicero and Chicago yards, and then after about 9 months there, I transferred out to Aurora and started working out of there. Back to my, I wasn't actually born in Aurora, I was born in Chicago in 1946. And the family moved to Batavia about 1951. I did kindergarten, first grade at McWayne School, and then moved to Aurora, Nancy Hill School for second and third, and then Freeman School. We moved to Terry Avenue, Curry Street.
And Freeman School is where that was Randy's elementary school too.
Yeah, correct, yeah. Then Freeman School, that's probably where I met Dennis.
So Roger, it's interesting that you mentioned Eagle Scouts because in his boxes at San Francisco Public Library, his Eagle Scout uniform with all of its medals is still there.
Well, that's
So
wonderful,
He
yeah.
kept that till the end of his life.
That's a real wonderful testimony.
And I thank you for sharing the story about his father because that was shared with me by Gary. And to hear it repeated here just emphasizes how important it was to Russell and to his family. I couldn't include it in the book. It was just too removed from Randy's life. But the story that Gary shared with me and got quite emotional, choked up as he was sharing it, was that Gary was, I think he was an ambulance driver in World War II. He was in combat, but not a combatant. He was I guess like a medic, and he was sent to this location for what he was told was a prison transfer. And when he drove in, he saw all of these people men, women, children, elderly, starving, skeletal, thing like that. And he said, what kind of prisoners are these? What did they do? Who are they? And he was told, well, these were Jewish people. And his first reaction were, Jewish people? You mean from the Bible? You mean Jesus's people? And he was so taken in by that story that it made him anti-war for the rest of his life. And part of why the Shilts family was as fervently conservative as it was had to do with being anti-interventionist because of the horrors of war that Russell had seen taking these prisoners out of Dachau and impressing upon his sons. Like I said, it was to the level where Gary actually teared up telling me that story. And to hear that he shared that with you is really meaningful too, because it shows just how important it was to Bud as the father of this family to impress upon his children the horrors of that experience and that humanity should never again go to those lengths to conquer each other. And so thank you for sharing that. That connects to something I didn't get the chance to put as directly into this book, but that was a very meaningful moment for the entire family, for Bud to share that with them.
Was Gary, you said was in the Air Force?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would guess then he was the only Shilts child that was in the military then.
To my knowledge, yes. Randy did not serve. Randy was in college toward the end of the draft period.
Yeah.
And was trying, especially because he was trying to get exemption as a conscientious objector. But mainly he stayed in school and kept getting college deferments to avoid it until, of course, you know, the draft ended and he no longer had to worry about that. There was another hand here, someone who knew Randy. Hello.
It's grade one.
Grade one.
Yeah.
So you knew Stuart? You knew?
Well, I was hoping you were gonna mention Stuart Jones in that diatribe there because, you know, I wasn't expecting it to have a happy ending. But he was definitely part of the whole triumvirate there. And
Yeah.
we were all in the same English class together at West Aurora. And I also knew him through the Boy Scout
For sure.
situation. And I don't know if he ever mentioned to you that he changed Boy Scout troops. He was not originally in the troop that he became an Eagle Scout in, which his dad apparently, which I didn't know about, at Wesley Methodist, he was a New England Congregational when I was there, and that's where I got my Eagle Scout award. And pardon? Three. It's three. And it's the third oldest troop in the United States. And it's still functioning. But I kind of got aware of him after we left high school when the Harvey Milk situation came up.
Absolutely.
I noticed you didn't have the Mara Castro Street up there, unless I can't see it. Can't see it from here, it's wide. But yeah, that was the inspiration for the movie. Milk.
Indirectly, because of issues with the producers who held the rights.
Well, there was all kinds of legal stuff behind it.
Yeah.
And
But if you see Milk, you've
really
seen.
didn't get a very high recognition in the movie, you know, for all that he contributed to it, because basically movie and the book were pretty close to each other.
Absolutely. And they had to go back to all of the original sources who knew Harvey and recreate that because of the legal tie-ups with the producers who held the rights to Mayor of Castro Street. His friend Cleve Jones, who is mentioned in my book and is mentioned in 2 of Randy's 3, told me that he really wanted, in the worst way possible, to get some sort of acknowledgement to Randy in the credits, but because of the legal risk of these producers suing.
Very minimal, right near the very end of the
Right.
closing credits.
Right. But Cleve really regretted that because he felt that Randy deserved recognition for being the first to elevate Harvey Milk into the mainstream. That was a book that received good mainstream attention outside of the gay community, even though the New York Times didn't review that one. But
the other high profile recognition that he did get though was from 60 Minutes.
yes.
because they used him as a source many times when they had questions about what was going on in the,
Mhm.
you know, the gay community and whatever was going on as far as,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he knew everyone. One of the things that came up again and again, and I interviewed over 70 people. Most of those were oral history interviews. So I did long form, encouraging people to remember, sort of think back in their own lives to warm them up a bit before before I asked them specifically about Randy. And one of the things that came up a lot was just how impressed people were by how many sources he already knew. He cultivated relationships with people just in depth and breadth across the country. That was one of the things that first attracted me to his story. So I worked for a number of years in HIV and AIDS services, first in my home state of Michigan and then Minnesota before going back for my PhD. And I had taken a strong interest in the history and culture of AIDS organizations because they've really been unique places to work. The workplace cultures are not like anywhere else that I've ever seen. And a lot of that I think comes from just the very frank nature of what we have to do to educate people to protect themselves from HIV. And when I went back for my PhD, I took an interest in the history of those organizations and especially their prehistory, looking at the gay and lesbian community services that were just starting to crop up in the 1970s when Randy began reporting on the West Coast for The Advocate, which is still around today online. At the time was kind of the gay national newspaper of record. Around about the mid-70s, right after he graduated from the University of Oregon, I started finding in The Advocate these stories that were describing pandemic level conditions affecting urban gay communities that I recognized from my time in the field as sort of being the comorbidities around AIDS, issues with alcoholism, drug abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, social isolation, loneliness, mental health, everything we always talked about as being the social disease of HIV. Randy was writing about that a half decade before the CDC started reporting on these mysterious illnesses and deaths affecting gay men. And so I took this strong interest in going, wow, how clairvoyant that this person who I knew from And the Band Played On in the Mayor of Castro Street, I hadn't read Conduct Unbecoming yet, but that he had picked up on all of the clusters around HIV before we knew that there was a disease at the center of that. And I was sitting in a reading room at the University of Minnesota in their archives looking at old advocates, and I thought to myself, wow, I wonder what his biography says about that. It was in 2012. And then I looked and I couldn't find one. And then, as Roger mentioned, there was another academic who was working on a dissertation, who had done a dissertation on Randy, who then turned that into an academic biography, which is also out. University of Illinois Press published it, Dr. Andrew Stoner. So it's a very interesting book written for an academic audience. Mine's written for mass market. And he and I had conversations over email at the beginning of my project, and he was very encouraging. Sad to say he passed away a couple of years ago, which I really am sad about because I would have loved to have spent time having a panel with him and doing a discussion like we're doing now, because I think between the two of us, we would both have really interesting things to say about it. But my experience of him came out of realizing, and the point back to what you were saying, these articles were so well sourced. You know, this young man was on the West Coast. He had moved to San Francisco from Eugene, Oregon, Portland, Oregon, actually, at that point. And he was citing gay alcoholism workers in Hawaii, South Carolina, Chicago, Houston, all around this country. This young man was already cultivating these sources everywhere that he could draw together to support some of the first emerging data that was showing these disproportionate levels of alcohol and drug abuse in urban gay populations. He wasn't just focusing on what he saw in front of him. He was doing the networking and the relationship building all across the country to support those arguments, which is very, very skilled and very challenging, especially for a young journalist. But he was known for being brash and fearless and not being afraid to ask people difficult and uncomfortable questions. And so he was getting to the heart of some of these stories to such a level that nearly 10 years later, I found a video of him. I can't remember what group he was talking to, but he was talking about with respect to the AIDS epidemic. He said, I was writing about all of these things in 1975. I can't believe I didn't see this even then, that he had picked up on how this all fed into what he was later reporting on when he became the most famous AIDS journalist of his generation. Other questions? Two right here.
Oh, I was just wondering, when did Randy move away from Aurora?
January, I know the exact date, January 15th, 1970. He got a flight to Denver, and then he hitchhiked his way across the country, and the next place where I picked him up was in Portland. So there was a period of about 3-4-ish months where nobody quite knows where he was or what he did. But he came to live in a boarding house in part of Portland known as Goose Hollow, where he met a woman who became his oldest friend, Linda Albin, who later became his business manager after Ann the band played on. And the Randy who popped up in Portland had already started to transform a bit from the young Republican you just heard about in my reading. Hair had grown out, he had the big curly afro. He was living in almost sort of commune-like conditions. There was lots of wine and weed shared around the borders. It was a very colorful time in his life, and he was still very, very, shall we say, thrifty and savvy about finding ways to support himself. Story that Linda gave me, which I had to include in the book, was how there's a popular festival in Portland called the Rose Festival. It's in June every year, and Randy was working at a parking attendant at Portland Community College. Right next to the college was a parking lot that festival attendees didn't know was free to park in on the weekends. So Randy, on the day of the festival, dressed up in his parking attendant uniform, parked himself in the parking lot and collected money from everybody coming in to attend the Rose Festival, which gave him enough to buy wine for his boarding housemates and still, pocket a decent amount for himself. So, that, as you can see from the reading I gave you, he was very savvy early on. He saw being able to support himself as a way of gaining his independence. From a very complicated upbringing he had here. I didn't go into too much in the portion I read to you. His mother, Norma, struggled for years with alcoholism, had quite a violent temper, and Bud, his father, who's by all accounts a very gentle and kind man, was also kind of more of the passive parent in the family who would sort of retire to his amateur drafting board. He did a lot. He was an amateur drafter and would do that and leave Norma to handle the kids. They had 6 sons, 5 years apart each one, and she was an unhappy housewife in an era where women were not allowed to be much more than that. And it's a somewhat tragic part of Randy's story. But as he got further away and sort of came out from under that and blossomed, he really worked harder to understand and reconcile with that experience in his life. And it certainly carried through in the stories he told to the friends he made in Portland, Eugene, and then San Francisco as well. There's another question right here.
In your research, was there any connection between Randy and Ronald Reagan Jr. or even Nancy?
Not directly, no. No, not directly. I did think it was funny. I took a picture of it, knowing how he became kind of a nemesis of Reagan in the 80s, that in 1967, I found a picture of his card as a member of Students for Reagan. I just thought the poetic irony of that was too much to not pass up. So that he was that much of a true believer in 1967, who later came to really see Reagan as having personal responsibility for the deliberate neglect of the first 5 years of the AIDS epidemic. I mean, Reagan couldn't be bothered to say the word AIDS, even after his and Nancy's friend, Rock Hudson, was very publicly diagnosed. I'm sure many people in the room remember that news story. Yeah. Parenthetically, there's also a picture in the book. This isn't, so he didn't have a direct connection to Ron, but let's just say 6 degrees of separation, because I do have a picture of Randy in 1977 in Rock Hudson's Palm Springs house wearing one of Rock's caftans that I had to include. It was just too delicious to pass up. So I don't know that he ever knew Rock directly, but he was in Rock's house in Palm Springs. So, he at least was close enough to be 6 degrees from Ron and Nancy Reagan. But in terms of the Reagan family itself, I never came across any direct contact.
Did he go to college?
So he started out at Aurora College, which is now Aurora University. That was when he was 18, those first few months. Then transferred to Portland Community College after he settled in there. And from there ended up at the University of Oregon, where he, by the time he came to the University of Oregon, he was already out. He came out actually to his entire class, anthropology class at Portland Community College. It's another vivid story in the book. Absolutely terrified that he was going to be shunned by all of his friends and classmates. And instead, everyone accepted him, and that was a major empowering moment. Randy never went back in the closet after that. When he came to the University of Oregon, he very quickly got back involved in politics and ran for the student senate with the slogan, "Come out for Shilts." And he actually won a Senate seat as an openly gay candidate, except that in that same election, the student body abolished the Senate. This is a period of uprising in the University of Oregon campus. Instead, however, they replaced it with this committee, this fee committee, incidental fee committee, that was responsible for allocating all of the money collected from student fees. And he managed to become chair of that committee and form sort of this progressive coalition. His co-chair, vice chair, was a Chicana activist woman, and they put together this coalition that worked at sort of reshaping how student fees were what the money was being spent on. So he was instrumental in getting the first funding for Eugene, Oregon's Gay Persons Alliance, for example. He was instrumental in getting funding for more progressive priorities. He wanted to support things like free daycare on campus and services for returning Vietnam veterans. And he went head to head with the student body president, because the student body president wasn't eliminated by the student body, but the Senate was. So there were, in the student newspaper, these head-to-head confrontations that he and this person were having around the funding priorities. They wanted to take all the money that was going to the athletic department and said the athletic department was making enough money, we're going to use it for student programming instead. And that caused a fight with the student body president, and eventually the university president stepped in and of course sided against Randy. That was his one experience running for office, but he was probably one of the first openly gay elected student government officials in the country at the time. There's only a couple I can hear. I think there was one at the University of Minnesota who's quite well known there. But Randy himself made history with his activism and parlayed that into working for the student newspaper, adding a journalism major to his English major, and winning national awards and national recognition for some of the first pieces he wrote on gay life, which led him to be a finalist in the Hearst National Writing Competition in 1975. So he really did some impressive things at a time when gay college activism was just in its infancy. All that and more packed in here. Go ahead.
So was he was he truly like one of the first journalists to cover the epidemic, or did he take inspiration from like other people?
So it's an interesting coincidence in Randy's life in that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's first reports on these mysterious illnesses were published in June of 1981. In August of 1981, Randy was hired by the San Francisco Chronicle. He'd been in San Francisco for almost 6 years at that point. He had worked in the gay press, and he had been a reporter for 2 different TV stations, but, could not get a job in a mainstream newsroom. The San Francisco Chronicle had gay journalists on staff who were out to their colleagues, but not publicly out, and they would cover gay community issues when they would flare up, but not as a regular part of their beat. Randy became the first openly gay journalist to cover gay news as a regular beat in a mainstream newspaper, and a fairly substantial one, San Francisco Chronicle. So literally that happened 2 months after the first reports. And initially in that first 6 months to a year, most of the reporting on AIDS, even at the San Francisco Chronicle, was done by the science reporters, the medical reporters. It was all very contained to the coverage of the virus itself. But what came out of that, many of you might remember this, is in those first few years, a lot of the coverage of AIDS was limited to, you would see doctors in lab coats, or you would see skeletal gay men dying in hospital beds. There wasn't a lot being written about the social or political aspects of that pandemic. And Randy, from starting in 1982, but really 1983 forward, When he made AIDS his regular beat, yes, he was the first to do that. And what he did was remarkable because instead of just having these pieces on the medical intrigue, he was writing human interest pieces. He was writing about family members who were losing their loved ones. He was writing about the politics that were going into it. So he covered Chairman Henry Waxman, who was the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee for many years in the House, and writing about Waxman's reports indicating we need substantial funding. This is a public health emergency. And he was the first to really start digging into the politics that were keeping AIDS research from being adequately funded so that the people on the ground could actually run the analyses on the samples they were collecting from all of these people who were in hospitals getting sick and dying. So he took something that existed sort of in the medical realm and he expanded it to be the full human and political story we know it now to be. And that's where I think he has a substantial legacy still in terms of showing us we can't just learn about all the facets of these medical crises that do come up, right? We all lived through the COVID-19 lockdown. We understand there's more to it than just the science of the medicine. Randy was really one of the first to show that there was this much larger social and political implication, especially when the government abdicates its responsibility to care for the afflicted. Go ahead.
Speaking of COVID, did he ever have any interaction with Dr. Fauci?
He absolutely did.
Oh, I did.
Oh, he absolutely did. He interviewed
Okay.
Fauci a couple of times. I have a couple mentions of Fauci. Randy, I would say, and I tried to interview Dr. Fauci. He was a little busy during the period when I was trying to reach him. Randy was, I would say, constructively critical of Dr. Fauci. And I think it's important to remember that the Dr. Fauci of 40 years ago did not know as much as the Dr. Fauci of today. And he made some critical errors at the time, including one early on in 1983, where he made a casual comment that just exploded for all the wrong reasons, because medical authorities were starting to notice that infants were getting sick and dying from AIDS. And instead of connecting the dots on maternal transmission, mother to child, Dr. Fauci made a casual comment to the press about, well, it seems like this may be evidence that it may be airborne or spread through touch. And there was this explosion of news coverage that did nothing to help the science on the ground. It was a slip. He regretted it. He apologized for it. Randy mentioned it and the band played on. And rightly so, because it directed the press in the wrong direction from where they needed to be covering this epidemic as it was emerging. Another example he gave, though, which I think is important, was after And the Band Played On came out, and Randy regretted that instead of changing the politics the way he hoped it would, it just sort of became, the book sort of became part of the politics. And one of the things that he noted in his journalism was that Dr. Fauci would still, because he was an administration official, when he would speak to the press, he would say, we have all the AIDS funding we need. We have scientists working on this day and night. We don't, appreciate the activism to require more, but the NIH has enough. When he was compelled to testify before Congress and put under oath, Dr. Fauci admitted that of the something like although Congress had funded something like 125 research positions, at that point the Reagan administration had only hired 11. And Randy's point, which again constructively critical, was why are we only learning this when you're put under oath with the threat of perjury instead of being candid with the American people? I think that's a very important point for a journalist to bring up. We're saying one thing when you're talking to the press, you're saying another thing when Congress can threaten you. And so I would say he had a constructively critical relationship with Dr. Fauci. I think if Randy were alive today, I think he would consider him a hero in the present day. But like I said, the Dr. Fauci of 40 years ago, not the Dr. Fauci of today. And that person has learned a lot, and I think absorbed the lessons quite well from what he experienced early on. And thankfully, I'm glad that he did. Great question. We have about 10 minutes left, so we have more. Go ahead.
In the band played on, there's tons of detail.
Yes.
And one of the things that jumped out at me is the bathhouses
Yes,
and how a problem that was for transmission
yes,
and how the response from the gay community wasn't unified at all.
good way to put it, yes.
That surprised me, and would that have surprised Randy?
That,
That the two sides of the gay community were not in agreement on, should we tell people what the problem is? Or we're ostracized enough, we can't tell people what's going on.
Randy was very much of the belief that the alarm needed to be sounded. And I can give you some background on his perspective on bathhouses as someone who used to frequent them, as he did. But I think what was key for him, I'll say this before I go into the background because there's some interesting stuff there. But in 1983, he was the one saying, you know, we've got 250,000 people coming here for what we now consider Pride. Back then it was Gay and Lesbian Freedom Day. And he said, we have 250,000 people coming here. All we're doing is putting up the occasional sign and a bowl of condoms, and we're not impressing on people the risk of this. He said, you know, people are going to go back to their home communities. People are going to take this away, not knowing that, and we need to do something about it. And he faced some backlash from that. He faced quite a bit of backlash the more he reported critically on the bathhouses. I will say the person who I think was more surprised than Randy was the director of San Francisco Public Health at the time, Dr. Mervyn Silverman. And I interviewed Dr. Silverman, charming, lovely man. And having worked in AIDS organizations, I understand his public health perspective. I think he, not knowing the gay community from an inside level himself, was maybe a little naive, thinking that if he had certain gay leaders on his side, then he had the gay community on his side. And Silverman would try to move forward with measures to either close down or to heavily regulate them, and then get this tremendous pushback from other parts of the community. And he would be shocked because he had assumed from the leaders he talked to that he had their support. And Randy was quite tough on Silverman during many of those encounters because he was trying to get Silverman to act. He was pressuring him from his role as a journalist, which many in the journalism profession say is more activism than it is objectivity. But Randy was terrified about what he considered to be the potential biological extinction of gay men as part of the human race. Now, interestingly, Randy's relationship with bathhouses, I mentioned that he frequented them, which he did. My book has a very colorful chapter on the summer Randy spent working at a bathhouse in Portland when he was a student at the University of Oregon. And from that himself, he gained an insider's perspective on how exploitative and cynical those business owners and managers could be toward the community that they were supporting by being open. And so Randy's vantage point, he saw things like exclusionary practices towards trans women, for example, was something that he felt terrible about and had to do because his manager was watching him. Another piece was that unbeknownst to the customers who would come in, this place in downtown Portland was called the Majestic. And it was a seedy old place that still has reputation among people who remember it for just how unsavory it could be. But what the customers didn't know coming in was behind the glass booth on the wall facing the staff was what he referred to as the toad chart. And that was something that the manager had put up where pricing and room availability was based on the customer's looks. And so the youngest, hottest people coming in got the cheapest rooms toward the front so they would be more visible. And then the toad chart showed all the different levels that sort of rated the price people would have to pay and how far tucked in the back out of the way the rooms would be. So the toads were illustrated with like sort of magazine cutout pictures of people like Lawrence Welk, Richard Nixon, Leonid Brezhnev, all of that. And there were some poor souls who were just turned away. And Randy just felt awful about that. He said there were people that would be told Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock that they were full up and they would be wandering from place to place, being turned away at every location. He felt awful about that. And 10 years later, when he was reporting on the bathhouse's practices around AIDS and their resistance to any sort of public health measures, he had internalized what he had seen up close in terms of their cynical business practices. And a quote he includes in and the band played on, which was from one of the AIDS doctors that was one of his sources, was a bathhouse owner saying to that doctor in 1984, you know, I don't see what the problem is. We make money when they come in, you make money when they come out. So, Randy had strong feelings about the bats, but they were not based on, I would say, his own sort of internalized homophobia or prudishness or anything like that. You'll see when you read my book, Randy was not a prude. But he had a very strong sense of wanting to protect members of his community that could be made more vulnerable by the environments in which they would look for sexual intimacy. And I think that's an important piece of the context to consider with his legacy. We have 3 minutes left, 2. We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
What was your tipping point? When did you take this from, I'm really interested in learning about his life, to, oh, wow, I'm writing a book?
Almost immediately. I mean, as soon as I saw that there wasn't one, I mean, it was just an opportunity of going, this could be really meaningful. And not a lot of people do this when they haven't finished their dissertation yet, when they're doing a PhD. It's sort of, I would put it up there in terms of the, go talk to someone professional about this, to actually take on another decade-long project after you do your doctoral dissertation. But I really wanted to do this. I did not have strong feelings for him. I knew next to nothing about his personal life. I had admired him from the books that he read, but I wasn't so devoted to him that when I came across it, it was like, yeah. But the story itself just seemed so interesting. And I knew from my work in the field that there are still so many stories around the HIV and AIDS epidemic that have not been told. And he, having such a significant legacy to it, I thought was an important one to tell. And I'll just add this as we close, because we got a minute or two left. From the time I started this, anywhere I would go and meet people outside of my little bubble of the LGBTQ community, especially if they were 40 and older, they would ask, oh, you're writing a book. Who are you writing about? If I said Randy Shilts, they go, who? If I said, and the band played on, immediately after, they go, oh. And there would be this spark of recognition and this sort of emotional reaction. And then more than half the time, someone would start telling me a story. And that story would be about somebody they knew, somebody they had a relationship with, someone they were close to that they lost. And I heard about the roommate in New York in 1983, who this person took care of until they died. I learned about the uncle who, left to the West Coast to join the priesthood, who the last time they were seen, they had lesions on their face. Just recently, when I was in Guerneville, California, which is where Randy's home was and where he's buried, ran into a woman about my age and just struck up a conversation, and she asked what my book was about, and I showed her the cover, and she went, holy, and she started telling me a story about her best friend in college who had come out to her as a freshman and couldn't tell anyone else. This person was deeply closeted, a teenager in 1993, and went and got tested and tested positive. And thankfully is still with us today. I made sure to ask her about that. But something I picked up on very early in my research is that for so many people, his book was a touchstone back to their own loss, their own grief, and their own story of someone in their lives. And he gave them away for all of the imperfections that And the Band Played On has, and it does have them. It gave people a way to connect back to somebody they loved and someone they lost in a way that defined that loss as an injustice, which for people old enough to remember the early years of the AIDS epidemic was not the case. It is still a heavily stigmatized, heavily prejudiced pandemic. We are here the day after World AIDS Day, and that's an important day for us still to remember. There's lots of activities happening this week. But for so many people, that book is a touchstone back to a loss that they experienced in their own lives in a way that helps them to remember and memorialize someone who is meaningful to them. And I think his way of changing the narrative, changing the conversation around AIDS in this country is still something that is a remarkable feat to carry off. Because as we still see today, narratives are hard to change once they get baked in. And that book, when it came out, effectively did that in ways that, for better or for worse, still affect us to this day. So thank you for your time tonight. I'm happy to sign copies at the back for anyone who buys one. I just appreciate being here in Randy's hometown, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming out. So thank you so much.